Okay, so what I want to do today was I want to give you an example of a directive testing, because there is a small gotcha that I want to show on testing a directive. And then I just want to open it up for some Q&A afterwards. Just kind of get a feel where you guys are and how comfortable you all are in the test. Okay, so the directive I created is down here. It is doing nothing but accepting a couple of attributes, and it has a button in it. And when I click on the button, it toggles back and forth between being bold and not being bold. Okay. When we look at the actual directive here, this is the directive. So at the top, you can see we have a nice little template. Let me get that a little bit bigger there. We have a template here that has 3 spans, a anchor that has a button decorative, and it is ng-click of toggle bold. It's an element. I created its own scope that is mapping some attributes of first name, last name, and email. And then here I have my click event, which is toggle bold, and basically just toggles back and forth between setting is bold true or false. Up here I used a ng class that says if bold is bold true, that means that class bold will be put on there. If it's not, then it will not be put on there. So this is a pretty simple directive that one might write. When we actually look at it in the code, you can see here it's person, first name is Jason, last name Dalton, gave it no email, and what you actually see on the page is this, right here. That's the actual directive. So, obviously we want to unit test this. So we look at the unit test here for the directive. So once again, you can see our describe. Remember what describe does is brackets a group of unit tests that you want to run together. The first thing I do here is I do it before each, instantiating the main app module, which is testing app in this case. And then before every single one of these tests, I want to inject a scope into my test. And I inject the root scope, and I create a brand new child scope for my app. And then here's the next line. So what this does is, since I'm running a unit test, I don't have necessarily a browser to draw these elements out. And I need some way of instantiating my elements to be able to test. So what I do is I use Angular element. And what Angular element is, it's basically the pseudo for jQuery, the $ something. And so whenever you see Angular element, you can, if you're from jQuery, you can just associate that Angular element as $sign. Okay. So I'm creating an element called person. Then you run the compile command on that. And what that does is it tells Angular for that element, run the compile and link methods on the element that it would normally run on Bootstrap. And then give me back that element. Okay? So that is how you actually instantiate a directive in a unit test, so that you have control over it and you can do things with it. So the very first test here is just simply, I want to see what the text is, and just the text. And so what it gives me is this text that is actually inside my directive. So you can see here, that's the text, and text. It will not bring in any of the HTML elements that you have in there. It will just give you the actual raw text that you have inside of your element. And so when I do element.text, that means this is what I expect to see. That test is perfectly fine. The next test is I have a element.find, and this is similar to a $sign find in jQuery. well, I'm looking for elements inside of my directive. And one of the differences, though, is on element.find or Angular element.find, you can't do selectors on just classes or IDs. You have to have it start with the element and then a ID or a class. So here I have span, and if I want to do a very specific one, I can do like this. And that will mean find all of the spans that have a class called bold. If I want to find children, then I do this. So give me all of the spans that have children that have a class on it called bold. So it's just one of the things you have to remember with Angular is that you have to start with the element first on the finds. It can't be just find me all of the elements that have a class name or all the elements that have an ID of this. That is a little bit of a gotcha that you may find even when you're writing regular just Angular code, not necessarily a test. Okay. And then what I expect here is I have 3 spans in my directive. I expect it to be 3 here. Okay, this is where things get a little bit more complicated. So I have this click event here, toggle bold, and I want to be able to know that this is working the way I think it should be working. So the top here is how you would normally expect to do things. So what I'm doing is I go find my span, all the spans, and then I want to get the very first one, and I want to see that it does not have the class of bold on it. So if is bold is false, then that means it won't have the class of bold on it. So that should be true. The next piece here is I want to go find my anchor element. And I want to grab the first anchor element that I have, and I want to execute the click on that element. Okay, and then I expect that bold, that class I used to have that didn't have bold as a class, to have bold and be true. And so this will work when you're working with normal browsers. So if you're running this test with IE, Chrome, or Firefox, this test will work perfectly fine. The problem, though, is that in the build system, they don't want to have to launch a browser to run the test. They want to do it with Phantom.js, which is a headless JavaScript engine. Well, since you don't have a browser, that means you really don't have anything to click on. So to be able to do that, we have to do a little bit something different with Phantom. And that's what this bottom test is. It tests the exact same thing as we test up here, but it does it a little bit different. So you can see here the first 4 lines here are basically exactly the same. We'll just want to see if our span has a class of bold. We expect it not to, and we want to go find that button so we can click on it. The next line here, we're creating a new event, a mouse event that we want to do something on. So we do a create event, mouse event, and we define that as a variable of event. The next one is we want to actually instantiate and listen for a event. And so that event that we are looking for is, or we want to execute is click. And that's what this line here does. It actually tells the browsers that we have a mouse event called click that we want to be able to dispatch. And then the last line here is simulating the click by dispatching that click event. And then the last line is same as before. So one of the things you have to be a little bit more careful about on your directives is that you're having to do events that the browser has to execute that might fail within Phantom, and that we are running Phantom within the build system because we don't want to have to launch browsers inside of that system. One of the issues you may have is, say, it's a Unix machine that's running the build. You can't run IE at that point because there is no Unix IE. And that's one of the reasons why we want to run Phantom is because depending on what system or what environment you're running in, you may have different type of browsers to run. So I'm going to post a blog this afternoon about this, just so that it will be out there. I may even put it on the wiki so that you can look at it there also. But it is something that just to be careful about when writing tests and you have to simulate events. All right, so that's really quickly on how to do a directive. This is pretty similar to all the other tests that we ran. If you have any questions, that's the other thing I want to go over today is kind of go over just any questions you guys are having or issues that you're having. The first question I did have was talking about controllers. So let's look at controllers again that we did last week. So here's my test for my controller. And once again, we'll look at the top here, and I've created a mock that I need to use to test data services. And this test is a data service that is returning a promise. And so this is an area here where I'm actually creating my controller that I need to test. So here I've injected the $ controller from Angular, and I instantiate the controller right here with this method call. So this is a constructor for controller that I give it the name of my controller, and then any items that I need to set up on initiation, like my scope and setting my data service to be my mock. This is where I do it, is within the mustaches here. And then now I have a controller that is instantiated, and I can now actually do things on my controller.
So, Jason, this always confuses me. I don't know why I can't keep it track in my head. But what is the, inject obviously doesn't inject, but so before each, this inject is a Angular function, it's a testing function, what is inject?
It's a testing function. So it's a way for Jasmine to inject things for you.
So what this is doing is injecting into my testing scope.
Correct.
That following function.
Correct.
So, but it doesn't have a name.
Correct.
Is it something like a global variable that gets instantiated and then we use that across the rest of the methods?
So that's what the scope right here is. The scope is outside of the before eaches. It probably should be hoisted to the very top. But scope here is something that is going to be used by all the tests inside of this describe. Well, once again, you can nest describes, so you have to be a little bit careful where you put this, because each one of these describes, since it's a function, a closure function, you have to make sure it's in the correct scope for it to be used by all the different tests. So here I have a variable called scope. I set scope to be a new scope that root scope created, and then you can see here I'm using it in all of my tests now. And it's the one that I created on the before each.
Okay, go back to line 21 again. Okay, so for each test, we're going to inject this function. Does this function automatically get ran when we inject it? Or is it, because that's the part that's bothering me. So we've injected a function.
Correct.
But what runs that? What's that?
Before each, the injection, part of the injection is to run that function.
All right, so we've injected a function that the for each will immediately go run it. So there's an implicit step in there to run this injected function that's this part of the framework.
Correct.
Okay, all right. So that helps, because to me it looked like we were just injecting this function, and this doesn't have a name, how we call it. So all right.
Yeah. So the injection. So this is a method called injection, and its purpose is to run whatever attributes it has. And so if you look at the code inside, what basically happens is this is a closure.
Right.
And so if you look at the code, the first attribute inside of inject, it just runs. And it then takes all of the elements or attributes that you're passing into, all these parameters, and instantiates them inside of the inject. And so Java, C#, all these languages are getting closures, and JavaScript has had them, and so it gets complicated if you never used closures before on how they actually work, because sometimes they get instantiated and run, other times they're just functions that you're passing around that you can run at some other time. This particular one, inject, actually does run that function. You could, in theory, come here and say, var test equal function, and then replace this here with test, and that would be legal. Okay?
Well, again, going back to my thing, to me, inject is I'm injecting this function, but there's also
this is actually a method here.
I understand that, but when I see the word inject, I say, okay, I'm injecting this function into my scope, my testing scope, but nowhere does it tell me that it's actually going to run it too.
Right.
So I can have a function, just a function in my scope that I would need to call later, but it doesn't have a name, doesn't have anything. So it injects it, then runs it, or it just runs it, which doesn't really even inject it. Right.
Yeah. Inject probably is a bad word, keyword form, because it's injecting, but it's not injecting the way you think. It's just running whatever function you passed into it.
I understand now.
So it's basically just queuing the dependency.
Right. Yeah. It's the same thing like here with before each on the module. This is a method called module that is setting up a brand new, it's a constructor for module, and it just runs that constructor every single time before every app. So that is kind of the same thing as inject, and this comes from Angular. Okay. Another one that provider. Let's see here. I don't have an example of it. I better do over here. There is another call. Hope I can find one. I think it should be in here. I don't have it in there. Let's see. Okay, here's the other one. So sometimes with the module, you also will need to provide how to explain this right. What provide does is it will replace a object that you have inside of your application with some other piece. So here's an example of one I have this mock chart service that I am using in my controller, and I needed to replace the chart service that I have inside of the injected. And so one of the ways you can do this is you can use the provide. And so what provide does is the value of chart service, replace it with this object instead. So if we look at the actual piece here, controller. Yeah, master chart controller. If you look inside of here, we have a chart service that we are injected in that we need to use. So one of the ways you can replace what is currently in there with something that you need to mock is to do a provide, and it's on the module itself. So it's not it's not a injected piece. It's actually on the module. So that gets a little bit complicated sometimes if you're not paying close attention. I could have also done it where I have this chart service as a global, and then inside of here replace it. There's really not much difference between the two. It's just this one allows you to any place that it sees this chart service, it will replace it with mock chart service. With the other way around, you're basically just swapping things out. And so if down the chain something gets called, if you haven't injected it properly, then you may not get it. So that's why the provide is out there for you, so that it's always replaced no matter where it's at in the call stack. So any questions or anything you want to look over and talk about?
Yeah, Jason, this is Hemant. The one first question that I have is, if you come down to this same test file, there is a place where you are actually testing the length to be as 3. So if in case when I run my karma test and if this is not 3, so it shows that test get years failed. Is that what this it method resembles?
Yes.
Okay. So is there a way I can test it like greater than 0, or should we? Is it like how do we?
Yeah. So there's not a greater than in Jasmine. Let's take a look. Because it basically needs to match or be defined, truthy, falsy, contain. Here you go. To be less than or to be greater than.
Okay, wonderful.
So I would be careful about that, because someone could go in and make changes to your class, and that test would always pass at that point. You know, so you need to know what you're passing. Remember, these tests are unit tests, and so anything that comes into your unit or into your object, you should know and have control over it. So if you're talking about back-end stuff, you mark that out, and you put into your object anything that you want to test. And so there should never be a situation where you don't know exactly what you're going to get for a attribute. And that's why I would highly recommend not doing greater than or less than, because if you do that, then that means you're not 100% sure what you're getting out of your mock. And then that means that test can give you false positives very quickly.
Okay. So I have a method within my controller which internally makes a HTTP web API get command for something else. So in that case, should I use this mock chat service kind of, or because that's a method? If I can actually point you to, if you go to the Webex, can you go to batch once? Batch and quickly show you JS controllers and partials, and then there's something called batch status.js. Yeah. So if you open this, the first method that I have, the screen starts with the data that gets loaded from batch status,
Right.
HTTP GET.
Right. Okay. So, a couple of things. One is, so having this HTTP GET in a controller, that's debatable whether that's good or bad, especially on the onload. You'd like to have that in a service so that you can test it by itself, and then anything that uses it you can mock out very easily. Now, since you did it here, the way you get around that is with HTTP backend. So let me, I don't know if I have an example. Is John on? No, John has.
Yeah, I have seen one class that is OIT log service.js, which is looking for HTTP backend.
Yes. So what you do there is, I'm going to pretend to do it here, is here you do a HTTP backend, and then you'll inject it here with the $, and then you would set it. Like that. And then inside of your test, at the very top, what you do is HTTP backend, I think it's win off the top of my head, get, and then it's this URL.
I think it's when get and then the path. Yeah, that's correct.
So you do this, okay, and that result something is whatever your mock data is going to be, and then you have to do a flush on it. So you do HTTP flush. And what that would do is get you past this point right here, okay? Now the problem is, one of the things I've seen in several of these is that you're making several calls over and over again, and so what will happen is, for every single one of those HTTP gets, you're going to have to make a flush to get past that next point, okay? And so and you have to do that on the before each, because to instantiate this object, this controller, you have to get past all those points. And so that's the reason why normally you like to do it as a service, is so that you don't have to actually do all that flushing. You just mock up that data to get something back, and now you don't have to worry about every single time I'm trying to instantiate my object, I have to simulate a flush to the back end. So if you look at this controller here, here's my mock data. And so if I do that as on startup in my net type method, this will always get called, and I don't have to do anything special to get past it. I may have to do a digest here, but normally I don't have to necessarily do that with some of these calls. Just only if I'm trying to simulate a promise at that point.
So now for any HTTP call testing that I have to make, I need to use it through HTTP backend, and then make sure I flush that out. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
See, since these are doing promises, it gets a little bit complicated. So what will happen is you'll come to here, and then this will basically stop here. It won't do anything because it's waiting for a flush. But it will get passed down to here because it's asynchronous. Okay, so all this stuff won't happen. And then once this gets flushed, if you're making another call to another method, like this one, then to get into this promise, you have to do a flush again. And so you have to do that in the before each because you'll never get all the stuff done until that before each is finished.
Okay.
Until all your promises get instantiated. So what will happen is, if you don't do it in the before each, then inside of your test suite, all this stuff will never get run, and so you never see any of the items inside of it.
But the flow that right now you're seeing is a sequential one. I mean, it's like synchronous.
It's not. That's the problem. Remember, the JavaScript is asynchronous. Okay, but you're trying to simulate a synchronous process by using the promises. But the promise is asynchronous. And so you run through your top level JavaScript immediately, and then it will finish. And now you have a promise that has to be fulfilled. That can be a second, it could be 5 minutes. It just depends on how you write your test. In the real world, it looks parallel, but it's actually asynchronous. All of it is being done asynchronous.
So in my test class, if I say the scope dot that first method that you're seeing as load data, so you're saying it just initiates that HTTP file and then it just waits there. Doesn't proceed further.
This is a promise. The line, it will go to this line, so this method here, so it gets called, it will do this line, it will do this, it will look at this line and it won't do anything. It will skip down to here and finish. And it's done, according to it. So that frame that executed that method, it's done. It is finished doing what it needs to do. And then there's going to be a second frame that gets instantiated waiting for this promise to finish. And something happens. Once it then happens, then this line will get executed, this one will get executed, and the rest of these in a different frame. It won't be in the same frame that called this function.
Right, but my test will not wait for that. That's what you're saying. It just finishes it up and turns out back.
Right, and so that's why you have to, inside of your before each, you have to finish this. You have to start something to finish this piece out.
Okay.
Because what will happen is, in your test, when you instantiate that controller, you have a call to this method. It will run this line, and then that's it. You won't do anything else. And so anything that happens inside of here will never get run unless you do a flush. And that flush essentially sets up a new frame for you so that this stuff can be called.
So any kind of testing for this kind of scenario I need to do independently. I cannot just call load data. I have to use that HTTP backend and test each of these separately, right?
Yes.
Okay. I see your point.
Yeah. No, and this will go for any kind of JavaScript testing that you need to do that does asynchronous calls. And one of the things you have to be very careful about is things may look parallel, and you may be trying to force them to be parallel, but they're not parallel when you actually get into the internals. Because like I said, the call stack will make this call, It will look at this line and know it can't do anything, skip to the end, and that's done. Okay? Another thread will pick this piece up when it gets, when the event actually comes back to say that it's resolved this. And so what happens to you on this is that then this gets run and then calls this method down here, okay? So that thread will call this line, this line, this line, look at this line, no, it can't do anything, then go down to the bottom, and then it's done with that thread. The next thread that gets set up for this response will then pick it up at this point. But it's a completely different thread. And the only way you can test that is by forcing the system to realize that.
But even, can we force that from the test end? I don't think so, right? We have to write
That's
that
what
even.
flush does. The flush is what does
Okay.
that.
Okay. So I have to explicitly make this call that right now you're seeing from my test and then flush it and then test the rest of the code, right?
Well, I mean, does this call get called in the init process?
Yeah, I'm still trying to write. I've written only one, but I haven't written completely.
So what you have to do is, this is where you will run the flushes, and so you'll. If I take this
Okay.
up, I will put it here. I'll put one here, and then the next one that is, I'll put that there. And this will get me through the initiation of that controller. I don't do it in each one of the tests because I'm trying to actually test stuff. I need to get through all the initialization of my controller at that point.
But if I write this in the inject method, will it let me continue the flow since I've written the backend.flush here? Because when I start that method,
all this will do is continue with the promises that it needs to do.
Okay.
Remember, this is an asynchronous process. And so you have to have something to kick off that next async process to run. This is not synchronous. There's nothing about it that is synchronous. It may look synchronous because of you not doing that. So an example would be on your class here. Let's see. So let's go back up here. So you have this promise and then, if I then at the bottom here do something like a console log, like this, what will happen is this will run, this promise will be set up, and then your console will actually display this. And then this will run. And so even within your test, the same thing will happen. Okay? And if I do the same thing after that other then, this will start running, and then that guy will then display, and then the promise will get finished out. So this could be displayed 5 minutes before anything that happens up here. Just depends on how long you wait on that call. You know, another example would be if I came into here and say I wrap this guy in I did something like this. Yeah. So if I did something like this, it will wait 50 milliseconds, 50 seconds before executing this flush. And so if I did that print, it would print, and then 50 seconds later, anything I did inside of that promise would get executed. Okay? So, that's why, when you're dealing with promises and you're dealing with JavaScript, remember, these are asynchronous processes. They are not synchronous. They run on different threads. And so you need to be very careful about when you write this stuff, knowing exactly what you're really doing on it. Because you may be feeling that you're doing one thing, but in reality you're not. You're just seeing things happen a certain way incidentally.
Okay.
Now, when we go back to the original testing that we did, let's see, log maybe. The digest, yeah, so here's some flushing. So here's an example. Now, I created this service, and then I have the test here to do things. And so, I have a post I'm looking for, then I flush and do something. But here, I do it a couple of times. I do one that's a 404, and I do one that's a 200, and I'm just flushing this stuff up and doing digest to make sure everything gets displayed. This one. And when I'm simulating any of the promises I have to do a digest to simulate promises. So here's an example here. So I'm doing a promise, and since it's asynchronous, the promise is I have to force the testing system to fire up a new frame for that call stack so that it can execute the asynchronous processes I'm trying to simulate inside the app. So the two ways of getting the test to simulate asynchronous process is that if you're doing HTTP backend or HTTP calls, you do it with the HTTP backend flush. Inside of Angular, you do a digest, and digest will simulate that next frame that you need in the event stack. Now, digest doesn't work with the HTTP request because Angular is looking for, it has a queue of items on a HTTP call stack, and so it's looking for something to be returned eventually on those promises. So digest doesn't quite work on that because there's no data simulated coming back to it.
I mean, because most of the batch screens are completely dependent on this promise and in making that synchronous process. So I'm just wondering how can we test all of them like this?
Well, so look at batch. To be honest with you, with batch, when we move over to the WIP, we're going to have to rewrite a lot of it because there's certain things that we're doing within WIP or within the batch stuff that we need to clean up. One of the main reasons is because a lot of it is untestable. So to be able to get good test coverage, we need to move things around and put them in the proper spaces. A prime example is DOM manipulation. Doing DOM manipulation in a controller is a complete no-no. That's not where you do DOM manipulation. One of the reasons why is because it makes it very, very, very difficult to test anything that you do in the controller at that point. So a lot of that we're going to need to move out into directives so that we can test it and clean up the code a little bit and make controllers do what controllers are supposed to do. Remember, controllers are only supposed to handle data and handle event calls. And that's what controllers are supposed to do. Not supposed to be doing DOM manipulations within the controller. The HTTP request,
so is there any particular screen or JavaScript file which you can refer me so that I can take a look at it on how we can refactor batch, like instead of doing that HTTP get commands from the JavaScript file and then waiting it and for the promise to get completed?
Well, GLM is written in more the way that we want things to be written. And
GLM.
you still have promises there, But the thing is we can mark out the promises a lot easier, and we can use a digest rather than the HTTP backend for that. And so we can simulate a lot of different things a lot easier with the services than we can with the HTTP backend. So GLM has basically the way we plan on doing it.
Okay. Okay.
So anyone else has a question? Okay, so one of the things that I want to talk about a little bit is just to remember that these are unit tests we're talking about right now. In the future, once we start getting good unit tests, we'll work on end-to-end testing and even some mid-level testing. But I wrote a blog last week about it. One of the things to remember with the unit test is that you're testing what your object really should be doing and can do. Anything that is outside of it, you need to mock up or know what you're passing into it. And so I gave an example of a Pi store in that you, as a tester, are on the outside of that building. You don't know what's going on in the inside, okay? You can't look inside of the building. All you know is you can go up to a window, ask for apple pie, and then at a certain time you get back an apple pie, and you can test how good that apple pie is. You can test how thick the crust is, how big the pie is, whether it has apples in it or not, what the temperature is, and that's what you can actually test, okay? But you don't need to know how they baked that pie, whether it was in one room, whether they had an assembly line, whether they actually got it from some other company and just heated it up for you. That you don't care about. You only care about what you can put in and what you can get back out. And so another example is if I go up to the same pie store and I have all my ingredients and I give it to them, and then 10 minutes later I get back a pie, I can test that pie. I can test what I gave them and what I got in return. But I'm not looking at the insides and trying to decide, oh, well, when they rolled out the pie crust, it was only 4 inches, even though I got it back in the right size. And I don't care whether it was 4 or 5 method calls inside that did it or just one method call. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why it's very important on writing the apps that everything gets put in the right spot so that we can test this stuff a lot easier and things are where they need to be. So you have services that handle things between controllers. You have directives that handle any DOM manipulation that you need to do and create custom elements for you. Controllers control the data and any event calls that need to be called. You have constants, and even on services, you have several levels of services that we can create, whether it's factory, a service. We can even create providers if we need to do configurations. So it's a lot about putting things in the right spot where we need to put them at.
One more question, Jason. With respect to this GLM project that I'm actually going through a screen, and the way the promise has been handled is by adding that promise to a particular using a tracker kind of. But even then, the method after that says promise.then. So even they are actually trying to wait. So in this kind of scenario, like, how do we use it? So
let me show you the huge difference between these two. Okay, so we look at, here's the data service, okay?
Okay.
So this is where the initialization of the resource handler gets called, okay? Now, resource handler doesn't have a promise. We have to create the promise for it, okay? And so when we look at this test here, I marked out the resource handler, Okay. On the resource handler, there's a call called query, and then its function is a filter, the callback, and the callback error. Okay. And all I'm returning back on the callback is success. Okay. So then I have here is a promise from the data service that I called. I expect that there is a method on there called then. So that means I did get a promise back. And then I execute the digest. And so that steps through that promise at that point. And then I can go in here and go into the actual then and see what I expect to have. I expect to have whatever I pass into it. Okay? And so the difference is between this and the HTTP backend and put it in the controller is I can create my mock to handle things however I want to handle them. Okay? And I can do stuff like this on that promise. So let's step up a couple levels up and go into the controller in this. This is right here. Okay, so here I have my mock of chart service. So if you look at the flow, there is a mock chart service, and that calls the data service. This mock chart service is doing nothing but passing that promise up to the controller so the controller can handle things. Well, here's the method calls. I have a method called chart data, and here's my promise, and then here's my data I expect to have from that promise. Okay, I can see here immediately what I'm expecting to get back from that service, and I've marked it completely out. And so I can, in here, do nothing. I can just bake it, and it doesn't matter what I do within here. When you actually look at what we do in the test, I don't have one here, but what I would do is I would do a mock chart service dot chart data, do a digest, and then do a then, and then I can get my data at that point. This is also, since it's injected into this provide here, whenever it runs through everything, since it's not a true promise, it will just make this call, and then it'll make this call, and just keep running, because it's not waiting for anything at that point. Because it's a mock data rather than an actual promise. And so when it sees that then, it will just execute this then.
Okay.
And that's one of the reasons why in this particular situation, remember I was telling you I need to do this in the very beginning? This is the reason, because I'm making calls for that promise, and so I needed to provide a mock data for this. And so I have the two methods here. The system doesn't know that the then is a promise or not a promise. It just knows I need to make a method call at this point. Oh, then I have a method. Okay, let me call it. If I return the actual promise, now I would have to do digest at that point. You can see here, to instantiate this controller, I never had to wait for anything to do it. And I'm simulating the promise with this then here, and this then up here. But since they're not actual promises, they're just method calls that I've done, I'm able to fake out the system to do that and not have to wait.
Okay.
And this is one of the reasons why pushing HTTP backend to a service makes sense, is because you can mark out that data and not have to wait anymore.
So when we separate the HTTP calls by creating a service, what you're saying is we can independently test that service and then test rest of the code by mocking the data.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, I see your point. Okay.
Yeah, and like I said, this is, when you go back to the Pi store example, anything that they do behind the scenes to make their pies, we don't really care about. And what we'll do is say they go and say we have a crust service that we call to get the service to get the crust in. When we test it, we mark out that service call to some other factory, and we give them the same crust every single time, so we know exactly what kind of crust they get. And that way we can test that our pies will be what we expect based on what we gave them. And it's the same example with this, is when we put it into a service, one thing we can do is we can test that data service individually by itself to make sure it works how we think it should work, but it doesn't necessarily affect everything else in the app, and we can mark it out and test it the way we think it should work. Now, end-to-end testing is where you catch things of they made a change on the service that may affect everyone else. Well, that happens on end-to-end or mid-level testing, but not unit testing. Unit testing is about your object and only your object.
Right.
And then we'll also probably move away from HTTP and using the $ resources, because you get a little bit more bang for your buck with that.
Okay.
Okay, well, that gets us to 10 o'clock. I know you guys got some other meetings. We have a quick tutorial over the Yeoman tools tomorrow, and then I may set up a meeting either for Thursday or Friday morning to just do some more Q&A. If you have any questions, please email me, and we'll set up a WebEx if you need to actually walk through anything or talk about anything. But yes, please start writing some of your unit tests. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Jason.